Thanks, Vaibhav, for joining us at the Career Deep Dive on Government Consulting. We have defined government consulting engagement as one where an individual is providing consulting services to any governmental body or agency by either being directly employed or by working with the private entity that primarily works on advising governments. Because you've worked with governments in so many different settings, we thought it would be useful to take your help to deconstruct the space for our listeners today. While you started your stint in the development sector with the NGO Digital Empowerment Foundation, you soon moved to become a LAMP Fellow and performed research for a Member of Parliament. Then you moved to your government consulting engagement where you were directly working with the Ministry of Skill as a consultant, and next you moved to Samagra and through them worked as a consultant to the Haryana state government. And finally, you're at Clinton Health Access Initiative or CHAI, where you're again working with government in government consulting but focusing on public health. So, can I say that you were at 5 jobs and out of them, 3 of them were focused in government consulting?
Yeah, thanks, Ria, for having me on this discussion. Really appreciate this effort. And thank you so much for the introduction. And yeah, directly jumping into the question right away, that's absolutely right. I think the way you're defining government consulting, of course, I think my stint at the Ministry of Skill Development, in some sense, and that was like within the government. But yes, you were consulting, people there. And of course, Samagra and Chai are like absolute case in points for government consulting, as external consultants who collaborate with government stakeholders at the central level or at the state level, sometimes at the district level as well, and you try to bring impact. So absolutely right, yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so for this deep dive, how about we start by talking about your current work with Chai, so that our listeners get a good understanding of like the work that one government consulting firm does, and later we can move on to talk about how these experiences were similar or different from your previous engagements in the government consulting space, and finally take your opinion on the space as a whole, space of government consulting as a whole. Does that sound good?
Sure. I think let's begin with this.
Great. Okay. Maybe just like give us a brief overview of Chai and its work.
Sure. So I work as an associate at Chai right now. The work basically entails, as you defined, it's public health consulting broadly, and multiple disease portfolios. If I talk about Chai India, we are in TB, we are in malaria, we are in uh, hepatitis, we are in HIV. So I think there are multiple spaces to work with in public health, and I specifically work in tuberculosis. So that's the brief of what my work, what my role at Chai is. Coming to the work, exactly what I do, there are multiple aspects to it. The first one is I work with central government, like the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and I also collaborate with state governments, which are the state tuberculosis offices, and help them in strategic procurements of private sector agencies to discharge work in TB space. When I say that, I mean, sometimes we obviously know that governments might not have the resources or the capacity to discharge some of the work which they possibly intend to or envision, and for that they need private agencies to step in and discharge that work on behalf of the government. So I help governments in strategic procurement of services for these particular areas within TB. And these areas could be diagnostics, these areas could be drug delivery, these areas could be advocacy and communications, these areas could be treatment management and patient management. So I think across the TB care cascade, I help state governments, procure services of private agencies. So that's one work I do at Chai. Second is obviously, I collaborate with the Ministry of Health on policies, and one of the very important policy I think, guideline that I worked was on the direct benefit transfers for tuberculosis. It's a scheme by Government of India, and for the first time, the government came out with the guidelines for DBT on how do you want to do DBT in the TB space. So that's a policy document now live, and that's something that I worked with. So I think broadly, this is just an example, but broadly, policy uh, policy drafting and I think policy making is something I worked closely with the government on. Third is a lot of program implementation, I would say. And this program implementation has another stakeholder to it. And there's a couple of stakeholders to it, I would rather say. One is, your funders. So I collaborate, very closely with funding agencies like the Gates Foundation and the Global Fund and, the likes of these. And we try and execute, certain pilots in the TB space to demonstrate, that okay, the way the TB management is happening is great, but can we do something more to improve it further? And these pilots are aimed at that. So we are, because I think most of us realize how the healthcare services got impacted in the COVID, and TB was definitely one of highly impacted space in that sense. And so like one statistic that goes around is 60% decrease in TB notifications during the pandemic. So we'll have to basically restart a lot of those things to bring to that level that we were before the pandemic was there. And that resulted in a lot of pilots that we thought needs to be checked. And a couple of pilots were on teleconsultations and a pilot on home delivery of TB services, be it testing, be it drugs, be it counseling services. So I work in those areas also with healthcare partners like 1mg, Pathkind, Thyrocare. These are partners that we work with as our execution partners. So again, these are examples, but broadly, if I were to classify, a lot of program implementation is what I do at Chai. Apart from policy making and the strategic procurement work that I do. So I think these are the three broad areas. I would put it in this, and of course, the fourth, which is which is very integral to all of this, is like hardcore consulting, where you have like clients in the diagnostic space or in the funding space who are looking to make their next round of investments, and they want Chai's assistance on whether this investment would make sense, would this result into impact, and questions like these, where Chai provides consulting services to these clients and to take market access decisions. So I think these are the four broad buckets in which I would classify my work at Chai.
Okay, wow, that sounds really interesting. And I just wanted to clarify. So you said you do strategic procurement for the government. You help the government with strategic procurement. You assist in policy drafting, and then program implementation that you mentioned. It is the programs of Chai that you may execute with the government, but you work on it with different partners like donors and healthcare partners, and government may also be a partner in that, right?
That's true. That's true. So the pilots are generally, they are not, they are Chai's initiatives. We would try to find funding for that. We'll try to find partners for that, and obviously we would try and convince the state or the central government, whoever we feel is more closely aligned. And because ultimately you have to deliver the program in their ecosystem, so
Yeah.
you have to align them. But yes, the programs are Chai's initiatives in that
Okay.
sense.
So in that, so can I say that the first two, strategic procurement and policy draft, are more government associated? Maybe program implementation is somewhat government associated, and the last you had said was hardcore consulting in the healthcare space. With this may not be government associated. Can I say that?
That's true. That's true. I think procurements, it's completely government. We work very closely with state governments there, and of course, policy making as well. And yes, program implementation, obviously, you take a buy-in from the government because at Chai, I think the value is that, not, we do nothing until unless, we partner with the government or at least align the government in our work. And that generally happens across organizations I've worked with. So that's how we also look at it at Chai, in terms of program implementation. And yeah, the consulting space, I think uh, I would not be, I would not like to put it in this way that it's not at all government. Uh, at the end, government is a partner in everything that we do. Uh, Possibly I could say that the client might not be government, but you end up working with them in some or the other way. Whatever the program is, they might be your fund, partners. They might be your guiding stakeholders. They might be your approval authorities. They could be in any role, but any work I think we do, government has to be a part of.
Interesting. Interesting. So you perform these four different activities as part of your role at Chai. So would you say that in Chai India, if I were to talk about every employee or most employees are performing these activities, or does the activities differ from person to person?
So they differ from program to program. Maybe a program like nutrition would be doing something else. A program at HIV or malaria would be doing something else. So I think it differs from program to program, and it's not definitely restricted to what I am talking about. We do very hardcore implementation also in one of our projects, where we have teams on ground actually working with doctors and patients and trying to bring that change at that very uh, you know grassroots level, I would say. uh, we also work on supply chain aspects. We have a very big program across disease verticals. We help people, we help governments and institutions in supply chain management. We have programs on market forecasting and market shaping and market access. So I think the portfolio in terms of what we do is much larger than what I do in that sense, and it really depends upon a program, how what the need of the funders is, what the need of the what the government is, of course, and definitely all this gets succeeded by what actually the need of the disease is, what actually the patients really need, and that multiplied by what your client and your funder needs. I think that's how the ultimate program gets designed. But I think it's more than what I.
Okay, got it. So this was about Chai. How would you say these range of activities differed at your previous jobs at Samakra and Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship?
Sure. So I think let me talk about my work at the Ministry of Skill and Entrepreneurship. I think uh, a very broad way of saying it is, while at Samagra and Chai, I'm sitting across the table. When I'm talking to the government, when I was in Ministry of Skills Development, I was sitting on their side of the table. So I think, that just by saying that, I think, that implies a lot of things,
Yes.
in terms of how you look at the program, how you look at your priorities, how you look at implementation, and what exactly your work is. So I think, at Ministry of Skills and Development, of course, I was working within the government. So it was a lot of, I would say, strategic thinking and policy making, I would say. Since I was housed in the minister's office there, I would not say, we were not directly into program implementation. We would always have partners doing that for us. And then back to monitoring, yes, we were there. So I think, the component of actual implementation is something that wasn't there, but a lot of policy making, strategic thinking, and program monitoring and impact assessment is something that was part of our work at the Ministry of Skill. And that kind of, changes a bit when I moved to Samagra, because now you are actually implementing programs at the district level, at the state level. You are obviously doing, I would say every role has some percentage of all the work that you do. It's just the percentages move around. I would say policy making and strategic thinking kind of reduces there. The policy is generally in there, and you don't really want to change policies a lot. You really want to just use them and effect change by implementing programs that align with those policies. But yes, so there's some part of policy, large part of program implementation, and possibly some part of monitoring. Vis-a-vis, in Ministry of Skills, large part of policy making, small part of program implementation, a very large part of monitoring. And I think Samagra and Chai, I would say, is very similar in that sense. A very large part of program implementation, smaller parts of, the other jobs that I talked about. So yeah, I think, in terms of what I do, this is how it looks like. But in terms of, the exposure, all of these are very different. In Ministry of Skills, I'm talking about working very closely with senior bureaucrats in the ministry and across other ministries and other departments, working with, I would say politicians for that matter, because, they are the executive head of the ministry. So, and when I say politicians, obviously, I'm talking about a lot of member of parliaments and members of legislative assembly who would want to collaborate with Ministry of Skills to do work in their constituencies. So that also becomes a very important stakeholder for you in that system. You work with a lot of consulting firms, who would want to, or who would be associated with the Ministry of Skills. You would work with a lot of partners, who actually implement your programs on ground. You collaborate with a lot of, I would say, corporate entities in what they are doing, and possibly, uh, learning from them or helping them align their work with government priorities. So I think the exposure is very different there. You even get an opportunity to work with your ministry counterparts in other governments in other countries. So Ministry of Skills, we collaborated extensively with UK, Switzerland, Australia, because they are the names. South Korea, they are the names in skills. When we talk about skills as we look at them. So I think we definitely get an exposure on international collaborations also. So I think that's how the exposure is very different in Ministry of Skills. It was vis-a-vis, let's say, in a state government setup, you work very closely with the Chief Minister's office. In one of the projects that I worked at Samagra, we worked extensively with, very high senior, I would say, leadership across domains, in the Chief Minister's office, in the Chief Secretariat office, in the AG's office, the Attorney General's office, with the additional chief secretaries of the department. You also collaborate with the district collectors. So I think when you work at a state, all these stakeholders become your exposure in that sense. Vis-a-vis Chai, it's public health. So you work with international organizations like WHO, Union. You work with healthcare partners like PATH and Find. You work with manufacturers, in the diagnostic space like Cepheid. You work with labs like Pathkind, Thyrocare. You work with new age healthcare partners like 1MG. You work with state governments because you have to implement programs with them. You work with the Ministry of Family Health and Family Welfare because they are like the guiding force behind all of these things. So I think as I said, the exposure obviously is very, very different in all of these experiences that I've had.
That makes sense. So let's delve more into these experiences. What would you say were your most favorite and not so favorite part in these experiences?
That's an interesting question. I think the answers really differ in each role. I'll try to respond to some of them, in as much detail as I would be able to. Uh, and of course, these are very personal to me, and these might not be like the general favorites that everyone would experience. So I think I would really highlight that to the listeners, that these are my very personal favorites, not really general favorites that you would experience in this setup. So of course, when you're working in the government, when I joined the Ministry of Skill Development, I was very young, compared to what I am right now. And I think that was I think I had not even completed 2 years of my professional experience. So I think just the exposure of the kind of people you collaborate with is was my favorite part when I was working in the government. As and I've detailed that in the previous question, so I'll not dwell into that particular aspect of it more. But I think the exposure of what you do and the magnitude of impact that you can create if you want to do good work is was my favorite. When I was working with the Ministry of Skill Development. So I think that's I think my favorite part there. The not so favorite part within the government was obviously not being able to, see the action firsthand or do the action firsthand. As I described, in my role, policy and strategy and monitoring was a broader part of it. Program implementation wasn't really. So I would always dependent upon the actual execution partners to do it, and I many times used to miss that energy and that thrill of actually implementing programs on ground. So I think that was sometimes not a very favorite part of me, part of my work at the government, I would say, because where I was situated. That's it. I think when I moved to like Samagra, things really change, and my favorite part becomes program implementation because you know the idea of getting things done and then actually getting on the ground and ensuring that they happen. I think that's the thrill and that's the excitement that organizations like Chai or Samagra would give you. And I think you would talk to anyone, the idea of implementing programs and not just recommending them is something that makes anyone would like, it makes anyone like this particular setup a bit more. So I think I would say those were my favorite parts when I used to work with Samagar or I'm working with Chai. Actually you can actually do that implementation and do that see that impact from your implementation, and the scale of impact is altogether different from any other thing. So I think the magnitude of impact is really high from what you do, and you really see lives changing there. So I think that's the favorite part. Again, when I'm working with when I was working with Samagra or when I'm working with Chai, I would say the not so favorite parts then become, sometimes the energy it takes to get things done, sometimes I would say. And I'm risking myself by saying this, but yes, sometimes you really feel that, maybe things could have been done quicker. And that sometimes make you feel, like why aren't they, the way they are in any other profession or in any other sector, or broadly in the private sector, I would say, in that sense. Although I have my thoughts there as well, which are beyond the scope of this discussion. But yes, I think I would want sometimes, that the things could be faster as compared to what they generally are. And that's possibly not so favorite part when I work with, and Samagra or Chai. And it's not like, because possibly Chai or Samagra is not being fast enough or the government is not fast enough. It's like how the system works, because, there are checks and balances in place. There are, regulators in place. There are policies in place. And you have to, navigate through all of that to effect that change. So I think, I would not say, I would not pin it to any institution in that sense. It's basically how the system works, and possibly, people like you and me, we can definitely work to ensure that the system moves faster. I think, yeah, that's it.
Great. So it was wonderful learning more about your work with these three organizations. Now we can move on to the next segment where we talk about government consulting as a whole. And the idea is that these questions will help listeners who have decided to explore opportunities in government consulting. Okay, does that work well?
Sure. Let's go.
Okay. So, would you do you think people need to have certain skills to be hired within government consulting? And if yes, what are they? Would you have any advice on how aspirants can build their skills for this role or for to prepare for the interviews?
So I think that's a very important question, and like often, people have asked me that question. Like, what are there any specific skills that you really need to be in the government setting? And generally, my answer to this is not really. And that's how I look at any work in that sense, that you don't really need specific skills which are otherwise not required, and possibly you have to do work in a government setup, you require those skills. It's again boils down to what magnitude of what skill is important in a government setup. So when I say that, I think the underlying skills of your how good a problem solver you are, how quick you are on your thinking, how structured you are on your on laying out your thoughts. uh, Obviously very very hard skills which are required otherwise to perform any work. I think these remain same anywhere you would possibly go. I think couple of things that differ, in terms of whether you want to work in the government consulting vis-a-vis possibly any other organization or any other role. I think the dynamics of stakeholder engagement changes altogether. You possibly how you interact with, let's say, a company and the CEO and the team of that particular company would be different from how you possibly would interact with a minister and the senior bureaucrats and the staff in the government or in that particular ministry. So I think the dynamics of stakeholder engagement quite changes a lot there, and that's I think something which is important. When you have to work with the government, it doesn't work the way you possibly would interact with a private sector organization. So yeah, I think anyone who's looking forward to this should really at least understand. Obviously they would not be able to experience all of it, but try talking to people and trying to observe stakeholders in this ecosystem would really help them have an edge over other people who have those general skills that are defined otherwise. So I think this could be a deal breaker in your let's say if you're appearing for a recruitment interview, and if you are comfortable talking to these stakeholders in the government, and the person is convinced. I think I have seen many organizations, spending a lot of their time, teaching this to their employees. And if you already know this, you are way ahead. I think. Second, I would say is not really a skill, but a mindset change that you require if you have to come into this sector. And this is not very specific to government consulting. This is specific to this broader sector that we are talking about. And you know here things are defined by the impact that you create, uh, not with the kind of business you are getting, or the kind of so the numbers that we talk about are very different. They are not your usual P&L, rather they are really impact. And that's a complete shift in mind change that you require here. If you have to come in this space, you have to understand how things work in this particular space might not be very similar to how you generally have experienced things, and the focus is also very different. I don't really see, you know, uh, a lot of focus or really any discussions on the P&L when I talk to the government. It's all about the kind of impact these organizations or your work would create in the life of people, vis-a-vis any other private sector organization you work, and your top line and bottom line are definitely a discussion point. So I think a complete mindset change is definitely required. Uh, if you want to be in this particular space. I would say the third thing that really is important in this space is obviously, some understanding of, how government functions. If you are, again, and this is, as you asked me the question, right? If some of the skills or some of exposure that the person has, should get in terms of preparing themselves for these particular roles, I think honestly, it's not really that, okay, a person with certain education qualifications should understand government. Any individual who is operating in any space should have basic ideas of how a government structure is, and that really helps you to understand and to accommodate, uh, from an employer's perspective, the individual, the person, the employer is recruiting. So how a parliament basically functions, who are members of parliament, what is a ministry, who heads the ministry, what kind of stakeholders are there in a department or a ministry in the government. you know I think who is at the district level, what kind of roles that the person plays, what are corporations or nagarpalikas. I think some basic understanding of government systems across domains is really, I think, an additional bonus point, if you are appearing for any interviews or otherwise, you have interest in. So I think these are, again, few things that I feel would be important.
Okay, so you said one is understanding how to engage with government stakeholders, two is mindset change, and three is understanding how governments function. Uh, so, in terms of how they can build these skills, like I think mindset change uh, is something that is something they can use self reflection to see whether they can accept it or not. Uh, then understanding how government functions, they can probably use internet to figure that out. But how would someone learn how to engage with government stakeholders on their own?
I think obviously, it's a very important question. I don't really have a exact answer to. Uh, but I think for an individual who really wants to learn this, you really can't just read it and learn or talk to people and learn. You have to experience it. And, that's where, the opportunities come into picture. Now I think uh, I am happy to club, what kind of opportunities people have to experience this exposure to government stakeholder ecosystem. And I think it really starts from uh, the all kind of fellowships that are available, that people should talk about and you should explore, to roles within the government, where you have the Niti Aayog recruiting young professionals, or different ministries and departments having their own young professional programs and young consultant programs, which are open to people like you and me. There are all these consulting organizations, who have a big public sector practice, and you definitely can experience those in these kind of organizations as well. You can also work with civil society organizations who would be working small, but definitely interacting with government stakeholders to do whatever they are doing. In that sense, so a lot of civil society organizations and NGOs are working in this particular space. So I think options are pretty huge. You have to talk about how they can do this, but ultimately, they have to. I think this is the third thing I would say. I think my prioritization was a bit off. I think you first really need the mindset change to go into the system. If you, because I've seen many people who come into a system, experience it for 1 year, 2 years, and they say, oh, it's not my cup of tea, and they'll move back to their other jobs they were previously doing. And mindset has always been a very, I would say, central idea to why they initially came and why then they left also. So you really need to align that, and I would not shy away from saying, that critical things like compensation and, role and, so all those things would require your mindset change, if you are driven by compensations, and if you are driven by, okay, I need that level of designations and that level of roles and that level of, superiority in my work, and, I need this much, XYZ lakhs and crores of rupees. I think it's a difficult place to be in that. So that's the mindset change, I'm talking about. And this doesn't really, many people don't really enter into the field just because of these precise reasons. So hence why, it's important for the listeners to understand that, it's not, in terms of your, very critical but basic questions. It's not the way it is in other organizations or other sectors. So that's the mindset change, I'm talking about. And once you have that, and once you understand some bit of government functioning, I think, there are a lot of opportunities where you can experience stakeholder management. You start small, definitely, and then you grow within the system to understand and manage these things. So I think, work with an NGO, who is working in this space, explore fellowships. There are many fellowships now at least in India, where you can experience working with these kind of stakeholders. There are consulting organizations. I miss one important aspect, which is like the CSR arm of many corporates who work closely with these stakeholders. There are organizations like Chai, who are NGOs but work like as legal entities, but work very, very core public health consulting. There are foundations like the Bill Gates Foundation and Dell Foundation, who are into impact investing in broad sense, but work very closely with the governments. There are multilateral organizations like World Bank, again, having a very important part to play in this entire sector. And again, you join one of them and you end up experiencing all of this. So I think there are multiple opportunities in there, but yeah, mindset is the first.
Got it. So, what would you say is the interview process like for such roles?
I think no, honestly, it's very I would say different for different organizations. It would be difficult for me to put it into one answer, but let me attempt that. I think generally, you know, you after your application and possibly your first CV shortlist, I've seen organizations now, moving from those, on in like what personal case interviews to like case exercises that are just given to individuals to do and then submit them back possibly a couple of days later. So I think that's usually I've experienced as the second round in many of these organizations, where they would have a case question, and they would possibly have outputs defined. Okay, they are looking at a cost estimate Excel, or they are looking at a draft memo of on a Word document, or they are looking at a presentation on the way forward, and you are given, let's say, a 24 hours or 36 hours to or 48 hours to do this particular job and then submit it to the organization. So I think this piece of this piece of interview in the overall process is becoming very important now, and most of these organizations have started doing this. And I think after that, it's generally like any other organization. You undergo multiple interview rounds with people within the organizations, and the number of those rounds is definitely subjective to each organization. I have seen organizations who have just done 2 more rounds, and recruited, and I've also seen organizations who possibly will do 5 to 6 rounds and then recruit you. So those numbers are, I really can't pin them down. But broadly, it's CV shortlisting, having this case exercise, and then some whatever number 2 to 6 rounds of interviews before you kind of make it into it.
And what would these 2 to 3 rounds of interview include? And it's okay if you say it's very broad, depending on the organization.
Yeah, I think of course, they are broad in that sense, but uh, it's like any other organization. I would say here at least, there is no hardcore difference from any other interview experience you might have had, where they would obviously assess you on your problem solving skills. They'll assess you on the culture fit, and I think here, when we're talking about the previous question, that comes into picture. When they assess culture fit, it's not just the organizational culture fit. Many organizations also assess whether you would be a culture fit into the government. So that's why those rounds, and that discussion that I had in the previous question becomes important. So culture fit from a government standpoint and from the organization standpoint is definitely assessed, I think, across all these organizations. Apart from that, obviously, yes, and very important, I think, is they assess your future prospects, and whether would you stay in the system. Because unlike other ecosystems, I think this particular sector still is really low on confidence that people will stay, and I think we really need that confidence in the individual, that okay, you are looking at public sector or governance consulting as a long-term option, and you would stay there. So I think these are the 3 4 key things, which possibly any organization would like to evaluate you on. uh, Apart from that, your basic education qualifications and your previous experiences are obviously looked at. But I would say not many organizations put a lot of premium on those things. It's basically, if you are a good professional who is culturally fit into the ecosystem, they would definitely consider you. So I think that's it. And yeah, I think one very important point when you talk to me about interviews, which I missed, is a lot of organizations have also started role playing now. So they would take on a role of a government official and want you to talk to them, or have a discussion with them as a government stakeholder would have. And they would assess you on whether you are, I think, mature enough to have those conversations with these kind of stakeholders. So I think role playing has also become a very important part of some of these interviews.
Interesting. Okay, great. I think I only have one last question for you as you wrap it up. Um, what have your biggest learnings been in this space? These can be simple realizations or some skill based learning, but would love to know.
Sure. I think in terms of skills, definitely, how a government functions, how these big projects work, what goes behind, creating these policies, creating these programs and schemes, implementing them. All of this is definitely, has been one of my biggest learnings. Because before I joined any of these ecosystems, and like many other people or our listeners who are hearing to this, they feel that there's a very common slang that sarkar kuch nahi karti, but that's really not it is. If you go into the system, you would realize that that's not really how we should look at things. Possibly the things might not be up to your expectations, or you might not align with some of the thoughts or some of the actions of some individual actors. But broadly, I haven't seen any government. I've worked with multiple state governments. I've worked with multiple ministries in the government of India. I haven't come across any broader, I would say, setting where people don't really want to work. So I think they are committed to it. Obviously, you might not align with their levels or commitment or how they are proceeding, that's your personal matter. But I think that has been my biggest learning, that there are opportunities here to work, and people really want to work. And looking at how things work has one of been my, I would say, an exposure. That is my biggest learning, I would say, working with the government. Apart from that, I think uh, what has been important, and I think what has been a key learning for me is the systems are not very different otherwise, and many of these skills are transferable. So, and this is for the listeners who are not in this space but want to be in this space. So apart from the couple of things that I talked about in the previous questions, you know don't be very worried about that don't have any experience in the government, so nobody would take me. And since nobody would take me, I would never have an experience. So that chicken and egg, don't fall into that. If you come across a opportunity that excites you, do go for that. I think this space is very open to, you know if I could say them, outsiders in that sense. So people really are not very you know uh, uh, you know affectionate towards, okay, no, you have worked in the system, then only I would take you. They are open to any individual who displays these basic skills and have a conviction and inclination to work in the system. So I think that has been my biggest learning, because initially I thought you can never enter the system if you haven't had the experience, and you can't have an experience because you can never enter the system. So come out of that vicious cycle of thoughts that you might have, and if you find an opportunity, do go for it, and you possibly might find your next job there.
Interesting. So, just before we end this conversation, just want to check if you have any other words of advice or thoughts for students, young professionals looking to enter this role beyond what we've already covered.
I think I talked about most of it, so I don't really have anything additional. Just have the faith in the system, I would say, and it could be sometimes discouraging or demotivating to not being able to move into the system, or the incentives might not be aligned to what you would have expected, or the things are not moving as fast as possibly you would want to. But I think stay in the system, keep working, and you definitely will see success. And the beauty of working in the system is when you see success, uh, the success gets multiplied when you see that it's a byproduct of the impact that you have created on multiple, hundreds and thousands and lakhs of people that who are getting benefited by the work that you are doing. So I think that's the key motivator at the end for me. And I think if you're looking at that, looking to enter into this space, I think if that is the key motivator for you, then I think nothing will stop from getting into this sector. Just maintain the basic skills that we talked about, have some inclination to work in this space, have the commitment to get into the sector, uh, possibly for the beginning of your career, if you can. Obviously every individual has different priorities, but if you can afford to keep your compensation and your want for superiority on the back burner for some time, if you can afford that, please do that, and come into the system, and you would really see great results. So I think that's it from my end, in terms of my advice to anyone who wants to be in it.
Thanks, Vaibhav. I'm sure that was really helpful. And with this career deep dive, I'm hoping that the listeners who are interested in government consulting can now navigate the space effectively. Thank you so much.